When people go on vacation, where do they travel? By and large, to locations of beauty. From storybook-perfect German villages of half-timbered houses, to gleaming white Greek towns hugging the Mediterranean coast, to classical capital cities reflecting the light of the centuries, they seek to escape their mundane localities and immerse themselves in visual wonderment. And hardly a traveller there is who, when vacationing, doesn't issue a sigh and nurse a wish that he could stay forever in these enchanting settings, or that his hometown could exhibit similar charm. Well, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, inspired by the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, for which a gleaming white city of stately structures and classical columns was created, a movement emerged devoted to just such a goal, called the City Beautiful. As the name implies, it sought to turn all North American cities into settings of grace and harmony. Unfortunately, we subsequently dispensed with that vision in favor of rather different priorities, and the results are all around us. Most people agree that the traditional right versus left binary is an inadequate schema for categorizing contemporary political oppositions. Voters may reasonably describe themselves as being fiscally liberal but socially conservative, for example, or vice versa, mixing ingredients commonly associated with one side or the other into a personal belief batter. And today, the right-wing classification encompasses individuals with opinions so diametrically opposed on even the most basic questions that they would have been outright foes just a few decades ago. Although we will, in this video, be employing right versus left terminology as a shorthand, the deficiencies of that conceit should be recognized. A more recent political dichotomy that has gained traction, and justly so, is globalism versus nationalism, which better slots contemporary political disparities into two meaningful camps based on the key issues of immigration, trade, interventionism, the climate scare, health impositions, and so forth. However, yet another framework may further clarify ideological oppositions past and present, and that framework, as a supplement to right versus left, or nationalist versus globalist, is aesthetic versus moral, or if you prefer, aestheticism versus moralism. A moral viewpoint evaluates issues in terms of good versus evil. The religious right, for example, has traditionally denounced many leftist policies as evil, understandably so, as they are explicitly described as such in their religious texts. Today, however, the left exhibits similar tendencies. Whether performatively, cynically, or out of sincere conviction, today's left often frames the actions or even viewpoints of the right as evil, though in place of that specific word, they use terms such as hateful, bigoted, or intolerant, or ism slurs such as racist or sexist. The left treats right-wing beliefs as heresies against the woke moral doctrines that they consider to be sacrosanct. Mantras such as diversity is our strength are to be accepted on the basis of blind faith rather than subjected to empirical evaluation. Anyone who challenges leftist dogmas on identity-based issues is framed as an unperson, a political sinner to be shunned or cancelled, and right-wing viewpoints are denounced as de facto heathen transgressions. The hate speech laws of today echo the blasphemy laws of old in criminalizing viewpoints that defy the current cultural orthodoxy. The political theology of the left may not have a metaphysical component, but it has its own secular saints, its totems, masks in place of crucifixes, and its holy days, pride weeks, and awareness months. In setting a moral paradigm that it demands all of society follow, it fully functions as an ersatz religion, with all of the attendant moralistic prescriptions. In contrast to this, an aesthetics-based orientation is, in the words of Oswald Spengler,
an ethic of which vulgarity and not sin is the antithesis.
An aesthetics-focused perspective evaluates political issues not in terms of good versus evil, to determine which approach is moral and which is wicked, but rather in terms of beauty versus disgust. By an aesthetic measure, that which is beautiful and noble, or that which yields a beautiful outcome, is to be preferred and pursued, whereas that which is disgusting and base is to be opposed and rejected. Tolerance is not a virtue but a failing by this measure, for why would one tolerate vulgarity or squalor? Aesthetics and functionality are sometimes set against one another, but when freed of ideological baggage, these are closely aligned aspects of the same standard, in that both are distinct from a good versus evil valuation. For functionality, preference is based on a measure such as, does something operate as it should? Does it accomplish its intended practical purpose, and how well? A functional evaluation may therefore be regarded as an incomplete aesthetic judgment, or an aesthetic valuation may be regarded as a superior functional assessment, for peak functionality is a component of aesthetic optimization. And beauty is part of what makes something functionally ideal and prevents it from deteriorating into soulless utilitarianism, which is just another brand of moralism. Though many treatises on beauty have appeared throughout the centuries, there has never been a formal catechism prescribing aesthetics as the optimal lens through which to judge the world and organize society. And yet humanity, and especially the Western world, has been making aesthetics-based decisions on the most fundamental matters since our emergence as a species, albeit instinctively, intuitively. It can even be argued that it was our aesthetic judgment, more than our moral sense, that enabled us to survive and thrive as we might not otherwise have done. Preferring beautiful ripe fruit over rotten, disgusting fruit is an aesthetic choice that helped us to optimize our nutritional intake. Favoring healthy-looking, attractive partners yielded more vigorous offspring and spurred enthusiastic propagation. An appreciation of corporeal beauty prompted improved personal hygiene. Preferring attractive environments fostered order and organization and improved our skills at craftsmanship and construction. Being repulsed by excrement or slovenly dwellings yielded better sanitation and infrastructure. These advances were due primarily to aesthetico-functional impulses rather than moral ones, and were the key to our civilizational success. In the case of our particular culture, what we call Western civilization, aesthetics has an especially rich legacy. Whereas some cultures were early adopters of the written word, literacy came later to Northern Europe. In contrast to other regions where the text dominated, in Northern Europe the image dominated. In lieu of a culture of letters and texts, Northern Europe long had a pre-literate culture of art and artifacts. During the Dark Ages, as Kenneth Clarke asserts in his famous BBC documentary,
it is arguable that Western civilization was saved by its craftsmen.
A culture that defines itself by tangible artifacts will be very different from one that is based on the written word. The latter will inevitably be more legalistic, contractual, verbal, critical, analytical, cynical, prodigious in talking and writing. The aesthetic culture will be one of creation, of building, of beauty, of seeking and making, idealistic, sincere, genuine, naive, and ultimately romantic. Even the indigenous European religions were not based on good-evil dichotomies in the manner of the Zoroastrian and Abrahamic faiths. Our gods, the Norse and the Greek, were incarnations neither of ethical perfection nor unethical wickedness. Rather, they had strengths and failings, were great or terrible, acted at times nobly, at times capriciously, in much the same manner as mortals. Morally indifferent forces, such as fate, prevailed in the Greek and Norse myths, in place of an eternal struggle between moral light and darkness. And even when a good versus evil religiosity came to us in the form of Christianity, our aesthetic orientation shaped it into a new form and mined it for creative awe, resulting in magnificent cathedrals, wondrous works of art, and later, in the less image-oriented tradition of Protestantism, glorious music, expressions that were not native to, nor inherent in, the belief system that came to us from the East. Throughout the centuries that followed, our strong sense of aesthetics, our love of the beautiful and our robust disgust response worked in tandem with whatever moral code prevailed at any given time, and remained strong even as our belief in the literally supernatural aspects of religion waxed or waned. Eruptions of anti-aesthetic, moralism-oriented iconoclasm did appear at times, but while they sometimes resulted in the tragic destruction of great works of beauty, they never tipped over into a veneration of vulgarity, merely of the coldly Spartan. In all conditions, our essential disgust response, which is just as important to a great civilization as is the positive appreciation of beauty, and is its handmaiden and corollary, remained intact and vigorous. For our present-day circumstances, viewing political issues through the lens of aesthetics versus moralism is a clarifying endeavor. The trouble with moral frameworks of good versus evil is that they are highly vulnerable to sabotage, being entirely contingent upon who gets to define what good is, and if the definition is set by hostile entities, subverted moralism can end up undermining the very people who submit to it. Malicious actors can create an alternative moral framework that displaces the traditional frame after gaining easy acceptance by mimicking its structure, merely populating its good and evil fields with different precepts, such as racist in place of evil or diverse in place of good. Furthermore, any moralistic framework invariably depends on doctrinal texts, and a text is always subject to interpretation. It cannot speak for itself, so whoever has the best powers of persuasion can make it seem as if the text means whatever the interpreter wishes it to mean. A population can thus easily end up trapped in a hostile moral system with pernicious effects, such as being effectively discriminated against, even while their own moral tradition is redefined in such a way as to have them accept or even abet their own diminishment. A turn-the-other-cheek doctrine can persuade believers to passively accept maltreatment. A meek shall inherit the earth teaching can foster an inverted hierarchy in which greater moral value is attributed to the indigent and unfortunate than to the productive and talented, which can even result in the latter being effectively made the servants of the former. New sins and virtues can be invented that accord with the leftist agenda, such as the sin of racism or the virtue of tolerance, which owe their transmissibility to the pre-existing notions of sin and virtue. And if malicious interpreters end up having state power on their side, then they can marshal the moral framework that they have subverted to lend to their own despotism the veneer of ethical justification. If you submit yourself to moral judgments, and your enemy captures all of the institutions, the schools, the media, that influence people's thoughts and define cultural norms, and then proceeds to use this cultural hegemony to redefine morality itself, both conceptually in most people's hearts and as a legal practical matter, then morality itself becomes weaponized against you. In our own day and age, the left has hijacked the good versus evil paradigm, casting DEI woke intersectionality as morally correct and the values of their opponents as morally wrong. They have created an alternative moral framework by which they have supplanted previous mores with new political definitions of good and evil displacing traditional valuations. How was this accomplished? In part because traditional moralism softened the ground and furnished a ready-made, guilt-based mindset that the left could exploit. It is doubtful that so many would have given credence to unfalsifiable leftist claims of systemic isms pervading society if they, the general public, hadn't already been made receptive to unprovable notions through traditional moralism. It was not difficult for the woke to retcon a dogma that characterized humanity as supposedly fallen beings who need to acknowledge, be ashamed of, and repent their sinfulness, ever burdened by original sin, into privileged beings who need to acknowledge, be ashamed of, and repent their racism, ever burdened by their whiteness. Even for those who no longer accept the theology associated with a fallen, sinful man doctrine, that underlying guilt-based self-perception, with its emphasis on contrition and penance, lingers as a cultural afterimage, providing a mold into which leftists can pour their woke ideology.